to the passengers on London buses passing it at a crawl. 911 Grosvenor Gardens did not merit a second glance on Thursday. The Georgian office building near Victoria Railway Station is like thousands of others around the capital, so few would bother to wonder what goes on inside. They might just have turned their heads, though, if they had been aware that this is ground zero for the most explosive dirty tricks row to engulf a U.S. president-elect for a generation. For the past 8 years it has been the headquarters of Orbis Business Intelligence, where one of the desks is occupied by Christopher Steele, the former MI6 officer who compiled a toxic dossier on Donald Trump that now threatens Mr. Trump's relationship with Britain, Russia, and the U.S. intelligence services. For more than a year, Mr. Steele, a Cambridge-educated father of 4, has worked in the shadows, building up intelligence from sources in Russia on Mr. Trump's dealings with the country after being hired by anti-Trump Republicans and then Democrats to find mud and make it stick. Anonymity is a spy's best friend, and Mr. Steele managed to pass his findings on to journalists, the FBI and MI6 without his name entering the public domain, until now. With his cover blown, he faces a personal fight to salvage his reputation after Mr. Trump loudly decried his dossier as fake. More worryingly, he has also dragged MI6 into the growing row, with Russia claiming he is still working for his former employer. The attention has switched from Donald Trump to the man who compiled the report, and the question of whether he, or the information he supplied, can be trusted. Murkiness is the hallmark of all spy stories, and Mr. Steele's is no different in that respect. His route to MI6 was straightforward enough. After growing up in solidly middle-class Wokingham, Berkshire, he went to Cambridge where, in 1986, he served a term as president of the Cambridge Union Debating Society. Coincidentally, his opposite number at the Oxford Union in the same term was Boris Johnson, now Foreign Secretary and the minister responsible for MI6. Mr. Steele, 52, was soon recruited by the Secret Intelligence Service, and by 1990, he was in Moscow as a spy working out of the British Embassy. His contemporaries included another young recruit, Alex Younger, who rose through the ranks to become the current head of MI6. While Mr. Younger was marked for greatness, Mr. Steele was described by one source as a medium-ranked officer of middling ability, who spent most of his 20-year MI6 career on the Russia desk. At one point he ran the 1001st 6th Intelligence Officers New Entry course at its training establishment in Hampshire, and he was appointed as case officer to the FSB defector Alexander Litvinenko. It was in 2006, shortly after Mr. Steele's retirement, that Mr. Litvinenko was assassinated in London with a lethal dose of radioactive polonium-210 added to his tea. Nigel West, European editor of the World Intelligence Review, suggests Litvinenko's death inevitably colored Mr. Steele's view of Russia and turned him into a man with a mission. By 2009 he had founded Orbis with Christopher Burrows, another MI6 retiree, offering clients access to a high-level source network with a sophisticated investigative capability. So it was to Orbis that Jeb Bush, one of Mr. Trump's opponents in the Republican presidential primaries, reportedly turned when he wanted to find material that would damage the billionaire businessman. Associates of Mr. Bush hired Fusion, a Washington, D.C.-based political research firm, which in turn hired Orbis in December 2015. When Mr. Trump became the presumptive nominee, the Republicans ended the deal with Fusion, but Democratic supporters of Hillary Clinton stepped in and continued funding Mr. Steele's research. By May last year, journalists in Washington were already beginning to hear rumors about the dossier, and by October its existence and the role of a former spy were being written about in U.S. publications. The 35-page dossier, however, did not see the light of day because of questions over its veracity. Journalists from numerous media companies spent months trying to find evidence to back up the claims made in the dossier, without success. Meanwhile, Mr. Steele, believing its contents to be too important to be restricted only to Mr. Trump's political enemies, is understood to have passed copies of his findings to both the FBI, via its Rome office, and to his old colleagues at MI6. The Daily Telegraph has been told that the FBI arranged a meeting with Mr. Steele in Europe, where they discussed his findings with him. Sources have told the Telegraph that the FBI's approach was approved by the British government. Then, earlier this week, the existence of the dossier became public knowledge when the CNN News Network reported that Mr. Trump and President Obama had been given a two-page summary of its contents, suggesting the FBI regarded it as sufficiently credible to be put in front of the two men. The news website BuzzFeed then decided to publish the dossier in full, as all hell broke loose in America. Mr. Trump used a news conference in New York to attack the dossier as phone, and accuse U.S. intelligence of deliberately leaking it to the media. Mr. Steele packed his bags and fled his Surrey home, leaving others to debate the questions that still remain over his reliability and that of his report. Intelligence experts are divided. Some have dismissed it as gossip peddled by Russian expats, while others have suggested that it is well-sourced. Opinion is divided on Mr. Steele, too. One former colleague described him as very credible and experienced and highly regarded professional, not the sort of person who will simply pass on gossip. Another said he was not top drawer. Former MI6 officer Harry Ferguson told the BBC, "Chris was a strong, middle-ranking cis MI6 officer, and I don't quite agree that this was a subpar report. It seems to me that Chris was careful as to try and find as many sources as possible to back these stories up, but also to make it clear that these are stories, and that what this intelligence report has at the moment is that it lacks that killer evidence." Meanwhile, Mr. Steele remains in hiding, possibly in an MI6 safe house with his wife and 4 children. His immediate concern is not for his reputation, but for his safety. His father-in-law, David Hunt, said from his home near Newbury, "Of course I know what he does. Some sort of consultancy, but only the broad outlines." Christopher never went into the details. "It's all very unfortunate because the last thing he'd want is for his name to be out there, associated with this kind of thing." His mother-in-law Jane Reveley said, "I didn't know anything about this. The first I knew was when I heard it on the Today program this morning." At his home in Hampshire, Mr. Steele's business partner Mr. Burrows said, "I think in the light of what has happened it would not be appropriate for me to make a comment on whether Orbis was involved or not. This is something we will review in the next couple of days. I am not going to make any comment on the dossier, as Mr. Steele contemplates his next move." MI6 will also be conducting a damage assessment of just how badly its reputation and its relationship with the Trump presidency has been dented. The fact that its boss, Mr. Younger, is a former colleague and reportedly a friend of Mr. Steele is unlikely to help.